When in the course of human events,
it becomes necessary
for one people to dissolve
the political bands which have connected them with another,
and to assume among the powers of the earth
the separate and equal station to which
the laws of nature
and of nature's God entitled them.
a decent respect to the opinions of mankind
requires that they should declare the causes which
impel them to the
impel them
separation.
to the separation.
We hold these truths
to be
self-evident,
that all men are created
That
equal.
all men are created equal.
that they are endowed by their Creator certain unalienable rights,
Their creator.
And among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
On July 4th, 1776, King George III wrote in his diary,
Nothing much happened today.
but much of posterity would disagree with King George. That day, delegates at the Second Continental Congress adopted what has become one of America's most prized political documents.
The Declaration of Independence is of major importance in our country's history, although it wasn't regarded that way at the time or for some years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. At the time, it was simply a declaration of independence from England. It had been preceded by an earlier declaration giving the causes for war. And so this one seemed to be one of a whole set of declarations that the Congress was enacting here and there. But certainly in retrospect, it has had profound influence in shaping our sense of ourselves as a nation.
Well, I think you can make a pretty good case that the Declaration of Independence constitute the magic words of American history, the catechism of the American creed. And I think you can probably make a case that it's one of the, if not the single most important document in modern world history.
When you reflect on how many people in different places have imitated it and quoted it and used it to justify their own expressions of outrage against what they thought was an intolerable situation, it's quite clear that many, many people have been influenced by what Jefferson and Congress had to say. Look at the women at Seneca Falls in 1848. Look at Ho Chi Minh in 1946 in Vietnam. And look at the Black Panther Party. All of them used the Declaration of Independence.
When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation.
These familiar words are not only a part of American history, they also have their own history. In the late spring of 1776, delegates to the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia were meeting 6 days a week well into the night, struggling to forge a consensus about how to respond to British actions of the preceding years.
The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world.
The Declaration of Independence leveled 29 specific grievances against King George III, holding him accountable for the Stamp Act,
for imposing taxes on us without our consent,
the Quartering Act,
for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us,
the Boston Massacre,
for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit,
the closure of Boston Harbor,
for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world,
and ultimately for the military skirmishes that had broken out between colonial Minutemen and British soldiers at Lexington and Concord.
He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us.
In the wee hours of April 19, 1775, on the village green at Lexington, Massachusetts, British troops in search of an arms cache confronted a gathering of sleepy American militiamen recently awakened by the midnight ride of Paul Revere.
Lay down your arms, you damned rebels, and disperse!
The battles of Lexington and Concord were interpreted and reinterpreted at the time as an attack by the British on the defenseless Americans. Of course, they weren't utterly defenseless. The reason for the attack was that they were mounting a defense and maintaining a munitions collection at Concord, and the British spies knew this, and that was their intention on marching on the city to try to capture those supplies. So everyone knew that trouble was going to happen. The only question is when and where it would happen. Lexington and Concord in 1775 were the beginning of the battles of the American Revolution. England had brought an army to Boston, and Boston was occupied for some months by this hostile force. But this was the first taking up of arms, the first shot that was fired in the classic sense. And once that happened, the war had started. I mean, the revolution had begun.
Having fired on British troops, the colonists needed the Declaration to justify their actions and establish the legitimacy of the revolution. The Declaration portrayed King George as a merciless tyrant.
He has refused to pass. He has refused to assent to prevent the population of these states. Representative houses.
The Declaration of Independence makes George the target finally, and this was an enormously important shift. Up until then, the Acts of Parliament had been complained about, and Americans had operated under the fiction that the king's evil ministers were giving him bad advice, and that Parliament was doing bad things, and if only Parliament would change its ways, things would be better. The Declaration of Independence took on the king, square and directly. It wasn't the very first thing to do that.
Earlier, in the same year, Common Sense, a pamphlet written in fiery prose by an Englishman, Thomas Paine, had spread like wildfire through the colonies.
Tom Paine called King George an ass, the royal brute of Britain, and he wrote the book in language that wasn't weighted with weighty philosophical and political science type arguments, but was written in very direct language that ordinary Americans could understand.
Small islands not capable of protecting themselves are the proper objects for kingdoms to take under their care. But there is something very absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island.
And it sold many, many copies very quickly, passed from hand to hand, widely distributed, read aloud in taverns, and made a powerful case for the independence, the inevitable independence of the American colonies.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
These are among the most famous words in American letters, and they were destined to immortalize the man who penned them. But when he wrote them, Thomas Jefferson was doing a job that others had rejected.
Jefferson was a member of the Continental Congress in 1775 who had said very little during the course of the debates up till that time. And in fact, Adams says he never heard Jefferson say one or two sentences out loud. He got a reputation as a draftsman, as a person who was not a skilled speaker, but was a skilled writer. And when the time came to draft the Declaration in early June of 1776, a committee was formed. The three most prominent members of the committee were Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin. Initially, they all thought Franklin would write the Declaration because he was the most famous stylist in the American colonies. And Franklin said that he made it a point never to draft a document that would be edited by a committee. And Adams was the next logical choice, since he is the so-called Atlas of Independence, the man who had taken the lead in the Continental Congress. But he said that he wanted Jefferson to write it for a couple of reasons. He wanted a Virginian to do it because they needed to bring Virginia along in the cause. He also said that he, Adams, had made himself obnoxious to the other members in the Continental Congress by pressing so hard for independence, and therefore the document would attract more criticism. And third, he said, because Jefferson can write 10 times better than I can. We needed someone who, in effect, could create a document that was, at least in many respects, a piece of propaganda. And Jefferson was naturally disposed to do that.
Transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun.
The world, in Jefferson's own imagination, was divided between the forces of good and the forces of evil. And therefore, he brought a kind of natural framework of his own that allowed us to see the British king in the most horrible way. And secondly, he had a lyrical capacity. He had the capacity to craft language that floated above events and that allowed you to look up and lift your head, and for different constituencies and different people to hear that language in the way that they would like to hear it.
Once the task of composing the Declaration had been placed on Jefferson's shoulders, he settled down in his Philadelphia apartments and wrote the first draft quickly. However, while in that room hard at work, he was not entirely alone.
Neither aiming at originality of principle or sentiment, nor yet copied from any particular and previous writing, I drew my ideas from the harmonizing sentiments of the day.
Jefferson was himself a product of the Enlightenment in the sense that he had read books, both from French writers and English writers, that suggested that the medieval era was now over, that Jefferson agreed with Voltaire, one of the great philosophers of the Enlightenment, that the last king should be strangled with the entrails of the last priest, and therefore that we were in a new world in which kings and priests would not rule, but the people at large would rule, and natural forces and reasonable men would be able to govern each other.
Well, the notion of all men are created equal is really a powerful notion that is new. That is, the Enlightenment. There was always a Christian basis to equality, but this is a secular equality that's being appealed to. And the notion that government rests on the consent of the people. Those are powerful notions, and those are new, and for the 18th century, new doctrines with great power.
But the Enlightenment notion of equality and Jefferson's own vision were far narrower than our modern understanding.
Initially, I don't think it meant any more than as a people, the now separate people, the Americans are equal to any other people on earth. That's, I think, what Jefferson had in mind, because all you have to do is look at his own life, where he certainly didn't practice equality with the women in his life, let alone with his slaves. But the interest of the word, the interest of the concept, is that other people could come along and say, yes, this applies to me too. And that begins almost instantly, and it's still going on to the present day.
Jefferson was not entirely comfortable with the gap between the ideal of equality and the reality of American slavery. He tried to resolve this in the first draft of the Declaration by laying the blame for the slave trade on King George.
He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery.
This passage proved too awkward for a Congress who didn't want any mention of slavery in a document that purported to promote liberty and equality.
This is debated and excised almost completely, and there are a couple of possible reasons. One is that they don't want, the members of the Continental Congress don't want any mention of slavery in this document to begin with, because it's an awkward truth that these are men talking about liberty who are also continuing to permit slavery to exist. It's a controversial issue, in other words, and would divide the delegations from the North and the South. In addition, it's a preposterous claim to argue that George III is responsible for slavery. Jefferson's actual position in the paragraph he writes is very popular in Virginia at that time. In Virginia at that time, it is very popular to oppose the slave trade, but not to oppose slavery per se. All the Virginia planters already had their plantations well stocked. Therefore, ending the slave trade increased the value of their slaves, and that became the position that most Virginians had throughout the rest of the 18th century. They can sound like they're talking against slavery, and they want to sound that way, but they're really only talking against the slave trade.
And Thomas Jefferson was always conflicted over this. I think that Thomas Jefferson was ambivalent about the fact that he wasn't able to live up to his own personal principles. And in some ways, you know, Thomas Jefferson is America, because that's what we as Americans are conflicted about. We got great principles, but we can't always live up to them. And sometimes we don't really try. And that makes us feel strange about ourselves. I think in some ways Jefferson felt strange about himself.
The draft of the Declaration that Jefferson had made was revised only slightly by the committee. They made one change, the committee did, prior to submission. Jefferson had said, we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. Someone, probably Franklin, changed it to self-evident.
On July 2nd, Congress turned its full attention to the document, carefully scrutinizing its wording and content.
They made about 133 separate revisions. It removes some of the sentimentality that Jefferson has imposed. They remove some of the more melodramatic and preposterous claims. For example, that George III established slavery and we can blame it all on him. Also, that the American colonies never acknowledged the authority of Parliament at all, and that they were in effect free and independent from the moment that they reached the shores of North America. That was a wild falsification. And so I think the document it retains Jefferson's lyricism, but is also a more cogent and more disciplined document and more stately document as a result.
Jefferson, however, failed to see the merits in this editing work.
Jefferson was sitting in the Congress during the 2 days of debates, uttered, again, not a word, and was extraordinarily upset that any change in his language was made. And he went to his death, to his grave, believing that every change was a defacement. And Franklin sat next to him during the course of the debate and told him a story of a hatter who'd commissioned a sign painter, and the sign painter put together a sign with many, many words, and eventually, after many rounds of negotiation, the only thing that remained on the sign was the picture of a hat.
On July 4th, 1776, the delegates formally approved the document, officially identified as the Unanimous Declaration of the 13 United States of America.
We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states.
These men decided to sign it, to put their names to this document, but the moment of signing was, in some ways, a very difficult one for them still, because they were in a position of committing treason. There was a war going on already, and if they lost the war, they would be traitors to the British government and would suffer the consequences of having challenged the monarchy in this profound way.
And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
What became of the signers of the Declaration of Independence? Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin obviously went on to illustrious political careers. But there were a total of 56 men who affixed their names to the document. These men ushered in a revolution that would change the world. Many lost their homes, their health, and their loved ones in the pursuit of independence. Francis Lewis's estate was ransacked and his wife taken captive while he was attending Congress in 1776. Thomas Nelson Jr. ordered his own house bombarded during the war to drive out British officers. Richard Stockton was captured and tortured by the British. He lived the remainder of his life as an invalid. But for all the damage they sustained during the war, the signers also reaped abundant rewards for their efforts. Many went on to become judges, diplomats, and political leaders in the newly formed United States. James Wilson of Pennsylvania helped to frame the U.S. Constitution. Samuel Chase was appointed to the first U.S. Supreme Court. Elbridge Gerry became governor of Massachusetts, served in the U.S. Congress, and was eventually elected vice president under James Madison. Some of the signers tried to incorporate the ideals of the Declaration into their own lives. George Ross retired from Congress and returned to Pennsylvania to seek justice for the Indian tribes of his state. George Wythe, a law professor whose students included Thomas Jefferson and James Monroe, freed all of his slaves during his lifetime. Benjamin Rush, a physician, was appointed treasurer of the U.S. Mint, but his most profound work was in his advocacy of improved education for women, better care for the mentally ill, and the abolition of slavery. The individual destinies of these 56 men were as varied as their signatures, but collectively, they will always be remembered for the day they stepped up to inscribe their names to America's birth certificate.
I am apt to believe that this day will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore.
Thus spoke John Adams, reflecting on the day when the Declaration of Independence was first presented to Congress. However, even Adams could not have anticipated how potent the Declaration of Independence would prove to be.
The Declaration turned out to be very important for numbers of groups in the 19th century. Temperance movements and other reform movements of the 1830s and 40s appropriated the Declaration and that language of the preamble and reworked it to suit their needs. Probably the most famous reworking of the Declaration of Independence came with the women's rights movement that got off the ground in a formal way in 1848 at Seneca Falls. The women there took the Declaration of Independence and simply rewrote the preamble to become gender inclusive.
From the standpoint of African Americans, the Declaration of Independence was not only a sacred document, it was a living document. You know, starting in the 1830s, free African Americans in the North held regular conventions, and at these conventions they would debate the problems, the issues significant for racial progress. They talked about civil rights. They obviously talked about the abolition of slavery. Many of those meetings, they would start out by reading the Declaration of Independence. The fact is that they knew those words had power, and they were determined to use those words as Americans themselves to address America, to not allow America to forget what it said it was all about.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
I'd say that the person who's most important in making it into part of our creed, something that we really do regard as very important, is Abraham Lincoln, who picks up on Jefferson's language and applies it to the new situation that he has to face in the Civil War and during his presidency.
The inflammatory ideals announced in the Declaration of Independence, that all are created equal, with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, have been rekindled in each generation.
We can see it ending slavery, and we can then see it in the civil rights movement of the 1960s expanding to include equality and voting rights and political rights for black citizens, African Americans. I think that the next group which is claiming it as its manifesto are gays, that the gay population of the United States now is saying that it is part of the mandate that Jefferson foresaw. And I think that they have a legitimate claim on that legacy.
I think we have to work on it all the time, every day. And I think we'll never have to stop working on it.